If there's anywhere in this crisis which has epitomised the tension between Whitehall and the places it governs, it is surely Manchester. Its leadership, and some of its citizens too, often defiant in the face of a centre they claim understands them not at all. Few here were surprised when the news came that they would remain in the new augmented Tier 3, but that didn't stop the frustration and the anger. Stockport's cases are lower than most in Greater Manchester, lower than some places in Tier 2. Even local Conservatives can't hide their unease.
I'm actually fizzing mad. We've really worked hard here in Stockport, and here in Bramhall we've only had 34 cases in the last week, and we're really gutted for all the shop owners, the restaurants that'll be closed, and we feel that we've been treated rather harshly because we've been lumped in with everybody else. We just feel that we don't deserve to be in Tier 3.
It's this idea of inconsistency which often rankles most of all. This graph shows all the local authorities in England and puts them into their respective tiers, but also shows their case numbers. There's a lot of crossover. Some places in Tier 2 with the same number of cases as Tier 3 and vice versa. But scientists, including this one who advises SAGE, think that sometimes, however logical, it can prove a problem.
When you go down to spatial regions, there's always going to be border effects and edge cases. So people that live on the edge of regions are going to have uncertainty and sort of slightly weird quirks in how they are implementing policy, and that's where regional or local policies can fail because people are confused and not sure how to adhere to policies.
Remember, Manchester was in Tier 3, then national lockdown, and it's still in Tier 3. Cases have declined, but they're still high. And I'm told that in calls with local politicians in the North and Midlands, ministers today haven't been able to answer which areas will get the extra testing, as Liverpool did, and what the criteria will be for exit.
No, I have my doubts about these regional tiers. We've been under them since the summer, and they just go on and on. The public don't understand the restrictions particularly well. They're kind of a halfway house that doesn't really work.
There are people, you'll be aware, I'm sure, who are saying that the reason why Liverpool is coming out of Tier 3 into Tier 2 is because they work with the government more closely than you did. What would you say to that criticism?
What I would say to the government is divide and rule tactics are never particularly appealing from a government, but they are not justifiable in a national crisis such as a pandemic. Steve Rotherham has said that if he was in my position, he would have done the same. He was just in a different position, with Liverpool's cases going up much earlier.
In the meantime, local businesses continue to wither. Newsnight caught up with Johnny just as Greater Manchester fought its war with central government before he was forced to close. His pubs, like many hospitality businesses, are now firmly on the edge.
It's going to be disastrous for the industry as a whole. I think the wider community is going to suffer. I mean, there'll be people that drink here, there'll be people that drink there, that may not see anyone from now until, I don't know.
Well, this is a profitable time of year, I would imagine, for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, I could probably speak industry-wide. People rely on Christmas to get through the kind of the lean January that we always have.
Given that the tiers didn't work before, i.e. they didn't prevent what they were supposed to prevent, a second national lockdown, then what hope can places like this have that it will work this time, that they will be able to escape their tier, especially when you consider that before we were leaving a much longer national lockdown where cases were much lower everywhere, when it was spring rather than winter, when we didn't have Christmas relaxation just around the corner and the January NHS pinch point as well. No surprise then that most of the people we've spoken to expect restrictions to endure here in one form or another until this spring.
Ministers argue that the tiers have been enhanced and at least they slow the disease. They are about to be tested once more. Either way, it's not as if the government has good choices. It's this or continued national lockdown just before Christmas which will ruin the economy yet further. In these short end-of-year days, the vaccine has never felt so close and yet so far.
Lewis Goodall in Manchester. Well, joining me now to discuss this is the former chair of Pizza Express, Lewis Johnson, Conservative peer Andrew Lansley, and Labour's Cat Smith. Good evening to you all. Andrew Lansley, first of all, you heard Graham Brady say there is immensely damaging to business. You heard the Tory councillor Alana Vine in Stockport saying she was fizzing mad. Will there be a big backbench rebellion, do you think?
I suspect there will not be a large rebellion, and the reason I think is very straightforward is because I think people, when they consider it, will realise that the structure of tiers that we had before the national lockdown, the second lockdown, wasn't working. And I think it would have maybe be helpful if the government had rather more frankly admitted that they weren't working. And we are less than a month away from the Christmas relaxation of restrictions. And we're only a little bit further on to January, which is the worst time for the NHS. So I think when they think about it, they'll realise what we have to do is to bring the prevalence of the infection down significantly. We can't go through Christmas and into January with the continuing level of cases that we have now. Even if it's coming down in some places, that is not immediately any grounds for relaxation. And I think people, including in Bramhall and Trafford and so on, I think even if they have relatively low rates, what they should be aiming to do, what we all have to aim to do, is to bring the rate of infection right down, stop the transmission if we possibly can.
Well, Cat Smith, you as a minister, a shadow minister, you saw Keir Starmer tonight. You know, what will Labour do next week? Do you think actually that they will abstain? Will they vote against the Boris Johnson's plan?
Look, can I start by agreeing with Andrew Lansley there about the way the tier system clearly didn't work last time, which is exactly why we've ended up in a national lockdown currently. In terms of the legislation coming before Parliament on Tuesday with the legislation on these new tiers, you know, we're going to have to study the details of that between now and Tuesday and really judge it against the scientific evidence. We're going to have to see where it's got support and buy-in from local communities and local leaders. And we need to see something for certainty for business, because at the moment there's an awful lot of businesses that aren't clear about what support they're going to get regarding to which tier their area is going into. And actually for areas like Lancashire, where I represent, the money from the last time we went into tier 3 still hasn't materialised. We're still waiting for the government to actually crop up and support local businesses and give that money over to our local councils.
But do you agree with the logic of this tougher tier system and actually having, 55 million people will go into tier 2 and tier 3, serious restrictions? Do you think the logic is right?
I don't have an issue with the logic of having a tiered system. I think that absolutely makes sense. I think the application of the tiers should be questioned in this case. Well, and as a member of Parliament representing a part of North Lancashire which borders Cumbria, the infection rates where I represent are far lower than the rates in Cumbria, which is tier 2. That's very difficult as a local MP to be able to communicate to constituents, because that just seems so illogical. Especially
let me put that to Andrew Lansley, because in fact you have an instance of that, Cat Smith. But Andrew Lansley, let's take Kent for a moment. Kent's got one hotspot in Thanet, and other parts of Kent are incredibly lower than that, but yet they're in a high tier. The high tier. Why on earth is that in any way logical or helpful, and indeed particularly perplexing for business?
Well, of course, one of the most difficult things is that there are indeed very difficult boundaries on this. I mean, I live in Cambridgeshire. I'm here in Cambridgeshire. Just up the road in Huntingdonshire, it's one of the lowest levels in the country. The other direction in Newmarket, which is Matt Hancock's own constituency, has one of the lowest levels in the country. But all of us in East of England are going to be in tier 2 from next week. So I think we have to accept that this is a pretty rough justice, because, but I would just come back to the point I was making. Even if we think, well, we have a relatively low rate of infection, isn't it our responsibility to try and make sure that we hit as low a rate as we possibly can before
let me put that to Luke Johnson. I mean, rough justice, but somebody's got to take the hit if we're going to try and get the infection down. And you know the hospitality industry inside out. Do you believe there should be some imposition?
Well, clearly these are difficult times, but the fact is it's very difficult not to believe that this is incoherent and arbitrary. And where is the cost-benefit analysis of the lockdowns? Did this last month's lockdown work? If not, why are we going into these tiers? And why do the tiers seem to be harder than they were even before the lockdown? And why, for example, is it legitimate to go to a gym in any tier, and yet pubs and restaurants are shut in tier 3? And where's the evidence that hospitality is spreading the virus. According to Public Health England, they're only responsible for about 3% of outbreaks.
But look at it this way. You know, the government gets a lot of revenue from the hospitality industry. Presumably this would not be their first choice, and yet they do see elements of infection spreading, elements of people moving around. We know that people moving around a lot causes infection.
Yes, but the government should do a proper risk assessment of what lockdowns cost, not just financially, but in terms of welfare. We've had none of that since the beginning as to how effective they are and whether they actually cause more harm than good overall.
Andrew Lansley, isn't that the point, though, that there hasn't been a proper analysis because things are moving so quickly? And what Luke Johnson has been saying, and actually some of these hospitality industries will not survive Christmas.
A lot of them are hanging by a thread. These are businesses that have taken years to build up. Pubs didn't even shut during the Blitz in the Second World War, and yet we are destroying the industry. Thousands of jobs. All the other people in this conversation have got safe jobs. You don't have to worry about being made redundant or having your business crushed through bankruptcy.
Andrew Lansley.
Well, none of us want this to happen, and I don't think for a minute ministers who are making these decisions...
All of them on the taxpayer payroll, none of them about to lose their jobs.
None of them want this to happen. I'm sure none of them want it to happen, which is why they had a limited national lockdown when, for example, the majority of shops have been closed. They wanted them to reopen. They wanted gyms to reopen because, for example, gyms, we know that there's only one case in every 100,000 visits to gyms. So the impact is very light and very limited indeed. I actually think, if you know, my personal opinion has been all the way through that we have significantly under restricted the amount of household mixing and over restricted those premises where people are making themselves COVID compliant and COVID secure.
Right,
and
Cat
I think
Smith.
that is really important that we do that. But Luke, like everybody else, has got to accept that it isn't very long now, hopefully, until we have a vaccine in the new year. We have to try and...
If you're on the edge of going bust, you don't have very long, do you?
By minimising the rate of transmission.
Let me bring in Cat Smith here.
Cases equals hospitalisation equals deaths.
Cat Smith, what are your constituents saying to you about these rules?
Well, I've been inundated by emails and phone calls since the announcement was made that the whole of Lancashire was going into Tier 3. And I think there's a real sense of disappointment. We were in Tier 3 when the national lockdown came in, and certainly in my part of Lancashire, the rates have come right down. The rate for the Lancaster district, for example, is half the English average. Yet we're bordering the South Lakes district council area with an infection rate double ours, using the same local hospital. Many of my constituents will go to school in the South Lakes, and there's many people.
So they're moving about. So moving about between one tier and another.
Tier 2, and I think that's the issue that my constituents have, is that we've worked really hard. We've really brought the rate down. And it feels like there's a collective punishment for the fact that actually there are parts of Lancashire that should be in Tier 3.
Cat Smith, do you think there's a problem that people, not because for any vicious, awful reason, simply might not adhere to the rules?
I've certainly had constituents threaten to not abide by the rules, but I've been very clear that the best way for me to make the case for my constituents to be moved into Tier 2 is for us to abide by the rules in Tier 3 and to show that we can continue to lower the infection rate far lower and take pressure off the local NHS. I just think that there's a logical way in which the rules is being applied, certainly in my constituency.
Do you think, Luke Johnson, that hospitality industry will adhere to the rules?
I'm sure that, people in my industry are law-abiding, and they will, because they don't want to be shut down or arrested. But I think to be put in this position, and as a country to be so happy to give up our civil liberties, and these are the most crucial weeks of the year for most hospitality businesses.
But we know that January is the worst month in terms of respiratory disease in hospitals. We have to make sure that hospitals are protected. The NHS, pressure on the NHS
haven't been overcrowded throughout the entire year, have they? Where are the hospitals that had no capacity?
But the thing was that by the summertime, we had done the job of the NHS. It had managed with the COVID crisis, not necessarily with other ailments, but had managed with the COVID crisis, it had coped. But actually in January, the situation might be very, very different.
But every January the NHS gets full of people with respiratory diseases,
but not
does it
COVID
not?
as well.
Well, it seems to me a lot of the others are disappearing, aren't they? Pneumonia and flu, where are they?
Thank you all very much indeed.